When it comes to bokeh or that blurred out background, it's easy to get that when you're shooting with a fast lens, 1.2, 1.4, 2.8, something like that. But can you still get bokeh or that blurred out background with a kit lens or a lens that isn't as fast? The answer to that question is yes, of course. And in this video, I'm going to give you some tips on exactly how to do that. So let's not waste time. Let's jump right in. Tip number 1. Shoot as wide open as possible. Now that seems like a given, but I want to touch on it anyway. If you're trying to blur out your background, it doesn't make sense to shoot at f8 or f11. You're working against yourself. So the fastest that your lens can shoot, open that thing up as wide as it can. If you have an f4, shoot at f4. If it's a kit lens and you're at f5.6, shoot at f5.6. Whatever your widest aperture is, that is the aperture that you want to shoot at. Tip number 2, you need to move your subject as far away from the background as possible. Now, of course, if you have your subject right on the background, it's going to be hard to blur out that background, even if you're using a fast lens. So you want to move your subject as far away from the background, so that way you have as much separation between your subject and your background. In doing so, you're essentially going to help with getting that background to be out of the focal plane of your image. Tip number 3, you want to get as close as possible to your subject. And this works the same way as moving your subject off the background. By getting closer to your subject, you are narrowing the depth of field that you're going to be shooting with, which means that background is going to fall outside of that focal plane and is going to help you to blur out that background. So get as close as you can. And tip number 4, use a telephoto lens. Now the telephoto lens isn't because it inherently helps with the blurred out background, but it helps with 2 things. Number 1, when you're getting close to your subject, it helps to not have distortion. If you're shooting with a wide angle and you have to get close to your subject, you're gonna have facial distortion. So that telephoto helps you get close, but minimizes that distortion. Number 2, what it does is it helps to reduce the depth of field. Longer telephoto lens typically have shorter depths of field. So if you use a long lens and you're getting close to your subject, that depth of field is going to be narrow, which means your background is going to fall out of focus. So there are the tips. Let's put it into practice and let me show you what I'm talking about. Okay, so first things first, let's take a shot at f11 just to show why it wouldn't make any sense whatsoever to shoot at f11. So there you have that image right there. And so now let's take this down to f5.6. And I'm going to use f5.6 for most of the stuff because just about every kit lens can get to 5.6. I know some are 6.3 and up there, but for the most part, 5.6 is good. So let's, you know what, for the sake of it, let's go 6.3. I'm going to go 6.3 because I like living on the edge. We're going to go 6.3. So there you have it. You can see the difference, obviously, at 6.3 and at f11, the background is still somewhat in focus. Of course, the subject is only probably about 8 to 10 feet from the background right now, but that's a start. So aperture is your first point. Your second point is getting your subject off of the background. Now, first things, I'm gonna put them right on the background, which is a terrible thing to do if I'm trying to blur out the background, but we're going to do it just so that way we can see. So there you can see that that background is very much in focus. Now we're going to move Smiley off of the background. We're going to move them, I would say that's got to be at least a good 15 to 20 feet. And we're going to take that same shot. And now you can see that there is a big difference in the background between the two. Just moving Smiley off of the background and having that aperture set at f6.3, we're able to blur that background. Now, step number 3 is getting close to your subject. So we're going to combine all of these together. So now we have our aperture that's wide open. We've got our subject off of the background. Now we're going to get in nice and tight to the subject. So I'm shooting at 105, I'm getting nice and close. And you can see right there, even at f6.3, that background is looking very good, very bokelicious. Now, of course, it would be a lot more blurred out if I was shooting this at something like 1.2, 1.4, f2, something along those lines. But at f6.3, that still is some pleasing bokeh. And the fourth point is using a telephoto lens. Now, the biggest point in using a telephoto lens is, number one, when you're getting close, it helps to remove that distortion, as I mentioned in the video. But the second thing that it really helps with is narrowing your field of view. Now, if you have a busy background like what we have here, it's going to help you to narrow that field of view so that way you don't see as much as the background. A lot of times, even when that background isn't blurred out, it's distracting because there's so much of it in your frame, in your composition. So in using a telephoto lens, it's going to help narrow that field of view so you don't see as much of the background and you're going to see more of your subject. So those are the two things of why you really want to use a telephoto for this. So let me just take this shot again. I'm going to do it at 24 this time. And of course, to frame it the same way, I've got to get all up in Smiley's grill here. So there you can see now, you're not going to be able to see it as well because Smiley is a two-dimensional piece of cardboard and paper. But if this was a person, an actual person, there would be a lot of distortion on the face and you don't want that. So using a telephoto lens really helps you to get close. So there you have it. Now, as I touched on earlier in the vid, number one and number two really are the two most important things. You obviously need to be shooting wide open. If you're stopping your lens down and you're increasing your depth of field, you're going to be working against yourself trying to blur out the background. So it doesn't make sense to shoot at anything but the widest aperture of your lens. And now if you're in a situation where shooting that wide open is too bright, then you really need to get an ND filter if you want to utilize this technique. And number two, you really want to separate your subject from the background as best as you can. Even if you are shooting with a fast lens, a 1.2, if you have your subject right on the background, it's going to be very difficult to completely blur out that background. Now, of course, it can be done with a really fast prime, but if you're shooting with something like a kit lens or something that isn't fast, it just doesn't make sense to have your subject to the background. Now, if you can't move your subject off the background, then it is what it is. And that goes into the next thing. There are some concessions when you use this. Obviously, it is going to impact how you can creatively compose your image. If you're having to use these methods to be able to blur out that background, you may not be able to compose it the way that you want. Getting close to your subject means you're not likely going to be able to do a full body or really even a half body. It's really going to be more headshot or this far right here. So you are going to be restricted in some ways with respect to how you can frame your image and what you can get. But that's just the nature of photography. You really have to decide what's more important. Do you want to blur out your background or do you want to compose your shot however you want? And whichever one is more important, that's the way that you go. So there you have it. Hopefully you found this video helpful. If you like this content and you want to support the channel, go ahead and give me a thumbs up. It does help and it helps to get this video in front of more people. And if you like this content and you want to see more, go ahead and subscribe and do like Anita Ward said and ring that bell so that you do not miss any future content. I appreciate you as always watching my video, giving me the support. Till the next one, take care.